In the middle of an empty desert, far from cities, far from civilians, far from the eyes of the world, one of the most consequential projects in human history quietly took shape. What began as a race against time, fear, and uncertainty would become a weapon powerful enough to alter the course of a global war and reshape the future of civilization itself. This is not speculation, nor myth. This is a documented, historical, and real account of how the atomic bomb was built in the desert during World War II. As you watch, share your thoughts in the comments, because this story still raises questions that echo into the present. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment related to this topic. Your engagement helps keep stories like this alive and visible. By the early 1940s, the world was already engulfed in total war. Europe was burning, Asia was locked in brutal conflict, and scientists across several nations understood something terrifying. Recent discoveries in nuclear physics had revealed that the atom was not indivisible, and that splitting it could release energy on a scale never before imagined. The fear was not merely academic. There was a growing belief that Nazi Germany might be working toward such a weapon. If they succeeded first, the balance of power would collapse instantly. In 1939, physicists who had fled Europe, many of them Jewish refugees, urged the United States government to take the threat seriously. Their warnings reached President Franklin Roosevelt, and soon what began as a modest research effort transformed into a massive, secret undertaking. It would later be known as the Manhattan Project, a name deliberately chosen to conceal its true purpose. The scale of the project was unprecedented. Tens of thousands of people would eventually be involved, most of them unaware of what they were truly building. Entire towns were created from scratch, hidden in remote locations. Among them, one place stood out for its isolation and secrecy: Los Alamos, New Mexico. Perched on a high plateau surrounded by desert and mesas, it was chosen precisely because of its remoteness. If something went wrong, few would be affected. If secrets needed to be kept, the desert would help keep them buried. At the heart of Los Alamos was a group of scientists unlike any assembled before. Theoretical physicists, experimental chemists, engineers, metallurgists, and military officers were brought together under intense pressure. Leading them was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant and complex physicist whose ability to connect disciplines made him uniquely suited for the role. He understood the science, but also the urgency. Time was the enemy. The challenge they faced was staggering. Building an atomic bomb was not a matter of assembling known components. Much of the science had never been tested outside of equations and laboratory-scale experiments. They had to discover how to produce fissile material, how to shape explosive forces with extreme precision, and how to control reactions that could otherwise destroy everything instantly. Two different paths were pursued simultaneously. One focused on uranium, a rare element that required massive industrial effort to separate its usable form. The other relied on plutonium, an element that did not exist naturally in usable quantities and had to be created inside nuclear reactors. Each path presented its own unknowns, its own dangers, and its own race against failure. Meanwhile, life in the desert continued under strict secrecy. Scientists lived with their families behind guarded fences. Mail was censored. Conversations were monitored. Many of the people working there knew only a fragment of the overall task. Even those at the top understood that a single miscalculation could lead to catastrophe, not only scientifically, but politically and morally. As the war intensified overseas, pressure mounted inside Los Alamos. Reports from Europe suggested the conflict might end before the weapon was ready, but no one could be certain. The possibility that Germany might still succeed first loomed constantly in their minds. Every experiment, every calculation, every sleepless night in the desert carried the weight of that fear. And yet, beyond the equations and machinery, there was another question quietly forming, one that few dared to voice aloud. If they succeeded, what would the world look like after such a weapon was used? That question remained unanswered as work continued relentlessly under the desert sun, pushing humanity toward a threshold it could never retreat from. The technical obstacles soon proved to be as daunting as the secrecy. Producing fissile material in sufficient quantities required an industrial effort unlike anything attempted before. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, vast facilities were constructed to separate uranium isotopes, a process so complex that even many of the engineers involved did not fully understand its purpose. Massive machines ran day and night, consuming enormous amounts of electricity, all to isolate a small fraction of usable material from tons of raw ore. At the same time, in Hanford, Washington, another unprecedented effort was underway. Their nuclear reactors were built to produce plutonium, an element created when uranium atoms absorbed neutrons and transformed into something new. This process introduced entirely new dangers. Radiation exposure, contamination, and mechanical failures were constant threats. Workers followed strict protocols, often without knowing why such precautions were necessary. Back in Los Alamos, scientists waited anxiously for the material they needed, but waiting did not mean resting. They faced a problem that no one had ever solved before: how to assemble a nuclear weapon that would detonate with absolute certainty. Early designs for a uranium-based bomb seemed relatively straightforward, using one piece of material fired into another to trigger a chain reaction. But the plutonium path quickly became far more complicated. Experiments revealed that plutonium behaved unpredictably. Its rate of spontaneous neutron emission meant that a simple assembly could cause the bomb to fizzle rather than explode fully. This realization forced a radical redesign. The solution was something entirely new: implosion. Instead of slamming pieces together, the bomb would compress a core of plutonium inward, using precisely shaped conventional explosives, squeezing it into a supercritical state in a fraction of a second. Designing implosion was a nightmare of physics and engineering. The explosives had to detonate simultaneously, down to microseconds. Any asymmetry would ruin the reaction. To solve this, teams developed explosive lenses, carefully shaped charges that focused blast waves inward. This concept had never been attempted at such a scale or level of precision. Testing these components became an obsession. Engineers built elaborate diagnostic tools, including high-speed cameras and radiographic techniques, to observe explosions that lasted less than a blink of an eye. Each test consumed precious materials and time. Failures were common, progress slow, yet the urgency never faded. Every setback was met with longer hours and greater pressure. The desert environment itself shaped daily life. Dust storms swept through the mesas. Summers were brutally hot, winters unexpectedly cold. Despite the isolation, tensions inside the project grew. Some scientists began to question the necessity of the weapon, especially as intelligence reports suggested that Germany's nuclear program was far behind. When Germany surrendered in early 1945, the original justification for the bomb seemed to weaken overnight. Still, the project did not stop. Attention shifted fully to the Pacific War, where fighting against Japan showed no sign of ending. Military planners anticipated an invasion that could cost millions of lives. For many, the bomb became a means to force a rapid conclusion. For others, it became a moral burden that could not be ignored. Oppenheimer himself felt the strain. He pushed his teams relentlessly, driven by a sense of responsibility that bordered on obsession. He understood that success would change the world, but failure could mean irrelevance or disaster. The desert laboratories became places of both groundbreaking discovery and profound unease. As spring turned into summer, the final pieces began to come together. The plutonium implosion design, once considered nearly impossible, showed signs of working. Yet no one truly knew what would happen when it was tested at full scale. Calculations suggested immense power, but calculations could be wrong. The only way to know was to detonate a device under controlled conditions. Plans were made for a test unlike any before. A remote section of the New Mexico desert was selected. Towers were built, instruments installed, and evacuation plans prepared. Scientists debated worst-case scenarios, including the unthinkable possibility that the explosion could ignite the atmosphere. Though calculations dismissed this fear, doubt lingered in quiet moments. As the test site took shape under the vast desert sky, anticipation mixed with dread. The weapon was nearly ready, and with it a moment that would define the 20th century. What remained was a single question that none of them could answer with certainty. Would it work, and at what cost? In the early hours of July 16, 1945, the desert was unnaturally quiet. At a remote site known as Jornada del Muerto, a steel tower rose from the sand, holding a device unlike anything ever built. The test was codenamed Trinity. Around it, miles of desert were cleared, instruments buried, bunkers reinforced, and observation points established at carefully calculated distances. Some scientists watched from shelters. Others chose to observe from farther away, unsure what level of protection would truly be enough. As the countdown approached zero, Tension reached its peak. Rainstorms earlier that night had threatened to delay the test, adding to the anxiety. If the device failed, years of work would collapse into embarrassment and uncertainty. If it succeeded, the consequences would extend far beyond the desert. At precisely the scheduled moment, the world changed. A blinding flash turned night into day. The explosion produced a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun, expanding rapidly before forming a towering mushroom cloud. The shockwave followed seconds later, slamming into observers with a force that rattled bunkers and knocked people to the ground. Windows shattered miles away. The desert floor melted into greenish glass, later named trinitite. For a brief moment, silence returned. Then reactions poured in. Some scientists cheered. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from ancient scripture, reflecting on the power that had been unleashed. It was no longer theoretical. The atomic bomb worked. Measurements confirmed what eyes had already seen. The yield was far greater than most conventional weapons. The implosion design had succeeded. There was no longer any doubt that the bomb could be used in war. Almost immediately, preparations began to deploy it against Japan. 2 different bombs were readied. One used uranium, a simpler design that had never been tested but was considered reliable. The other used plutonium, nearly identical to the Trinity device. They were assembled with extreme care, then transported in secret across the Pacific. Crews were trained, orders finalized, and targets selected based on military and industrial significance. On August 6, 1945, a single bomber flew over Hiroshima. At 8:15 in the morning, the uranium bomb detonated above the city. The explosion destroyed most structures within miles. Tens of thousands were killed instantly. Fires spread rapidly, and survivors suffered injuries unlike anything doctors had ever treated. Radiation sickness, burns, and long-term effects would haunt the city for decades. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Though terrain limited the blast somewhat, the devastation was still immense. With 2 cities destroyed and the threat of more attacks looming, Japan announced its surrender. World War II came to an end. For many involved in the Manhattan Project, the news brought relief mixed with shock. The war was over, but the cost was undeniable. Scientists who had worked in isolation now faced the reality of what their work had done to civilian populations. Some justified it as necessary. Others were consumed by guilt. In the aftermath, the United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons. But it was clear that this advantage would not last. Knowledge could not be unlearned. The Desert Project had proven that atomic power was real, and other nations would soon follow the same path. What had been built to end a war now threatened to define future conflicts. Back at Los Alamos, secrecy began to loosen, but unease remained. The laboratories that once raced against time now became centers for studying a new era of warfare. The scientists who had split the atom were forced to confront a truth they could no longer avoid. Humanity had crossed a line. As global attention shifted from victory to rebuilding, a new question emerged, one far more complex than any equation they had solved. How would the world live with a weapon capable of destroying entire cities in seconds? That question would shape politics, diplomacy, and fear for generations to come, and its answer was only beginning to unfold. In the months that followed the bombings, the desert where the weapon had been born no longer felt isolated from the rest of the world. Decisions made in secrecy now dominated headlines, diplomatic meetings, and military planning. The atomic bomb was no longer a wartime experiment. It had become a permanent factor in global power. Inside the scientific community, reactions fractured along deep lines. Some researchers argued that the bomb had saved lives by preventing a prolonged invasion of Japan. Others believed that a demonstration explosion, rather than the destruction of cities, could have forced surrender without such catastrophic human loss. These debates were not abstract. They unfolded in letters, meetings, and public statements, often from the same people who had once worked side by side in the desert. J. Robert Oppenheimer emerged as a central figure in these discussions. Once celebrated as the scientific leader who helped end the war, he now voiced concerns about the future of nuclear weapons. He argued against rapid expansion of the arsenal and opposed the development of even more powerful devices. His stance placed him at odds with military leaders and political figures who saw nuclear superiority as essential in a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, the geopolitical landscape was shifting. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, forged by necessity during the war, quickly deteriorated. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Intelligence agencies on both sides understood that nuclear weapons would define the next era of conflict. Efforts to control or share atomic knowledge failed as mistrust deepened. The desert laboratories did not shut down. Instead, they expanded. Los Alamos continued to refine weapon designs, improve efficiency, and explore new delivery methods. What had once been an emergency project now became institutionalized. Young scientists arrived, drawn by prestige and funding, stepping into a world shaped by secrecy and moral complexity. At the same time, the human cost of the bomb became impossible to ignore. Survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki suffered long-term health effects that doctors struggled to understand. Cancers, genetic damage, and psychological trauma emerged over years, not days. These realities slowly entered public awareness, challenging simplified narratives of victory and necessity. International attempts to regulate nuclear weapons began almost immediately. Proposals were made to place atomic energy under global control, to prevent an arms race before it truly began. These efforts failed. National interests prevailed over collective restraint. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly. The desert test that once felt like a singular moment now appeared as the first step in a chain reaction that could not be stopped. Each new weapon was more powerful, more efficient, more terrifying. Hydrogen bombs, hundreds of times stronger than those dropped in World War II, soon followed. The logic that had driven the Manhattan Project, urgency, fear, and competition, became a permanent condition of international relations. For those who had been there at the beginning, the weight of responsibility never fully faded. Some spent the rest of their lives advocating for arms control and nuclear disarmament. Others retreated into academia, trying to separate pure science from its applications. A few defended their work without hesitation, convinced that history had justified their choices. The desert itself remained, silent and unchanged on the surface. But beneath that silence lay the origin of a world forever altered. What had started as a race to end a war had become a force that threatened humanity itself, held in check only by fragile political balance and mutual fear. As nations continued to build and stockpile these weapons, the question that first arose in Los Alamos returned with greater urgency. Was it possible to control something that once created promised destruction on a scale beyond comprehension? The answer was still unclear, and the consequences of getting it wrong were unimaginably high. As the Cold War intensified, the legacy of the Desert Project hardened into doctrine. Nuclear weapons were no longer seen as tools to be used, but as instruments to prevent use through fear. This logic became known as deterrence. The idea was simple and terrifying. The certainty of mutual destruction would prevent any rational actor from starting a nuclear war. The atomic bomb, born to end a conflict, was now tasked with preventing all future ones. Military planners translated this theory into strategy. Bombers were kept on constant alert. Missiles were hidden in silos, submarines, and remote bases across the globe. Seconds, not days, became the margin between peace and annihilation. Every advancement by one side demanded a response from the other. The arms race accelerated, fueled by mistrust and the memory of what had already been done. Los Alamos and similar laboratories evolved into permanent engines of innovation. Scientists refined warhead designs, reduced size, increased yield, and improved reliability. The technical achievements were extraordinary, but they existed in constant tension with their purpose. Each improvement made the world safer in theory, yet more dangerous in reality. Public awareness grew alongside fear. Nuclear drills became part of everyday life. Children practiced hiding under desks. Cities built fallout shelters. Popular culture absorbed the anxiety, reflecting a society living under an invisible countdown. The desert explosion of 1945 had expanded into a global psychological condition. At the same time, cracks appeared in the certainty of deterrence. Accidents occurred. False alarms brought nations within minutes of catastrophe. Human error, faulty sensors, and miscommunication revealed how fragile the system truly was. The assumption of rational behavior could not account for panic, ideology, or misunderstanding. Some of the original Manhattan Project scientists spoke out more forcefully as these risks became clear. They warned that the weapon they helped create had escaped moral containment. International treaties attempted to slow the arms race, limiting tests and delivery systems. While these agreements reduced some dangers, they could not undo the fundamental reality. Nuclear weapons existed, and they could be used. The desert origin of the atomic bomb took on symbolic meaning. It represented both the height of human ingenuity and the depth of human peril. Few other inventions so perfectly captured the dual nature of scientific progress. The same knowledge that unlocked the atom also unlocked the possibility of extinction. As decades passed, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki risked fading into abstraction. New generations grew up without witnessing total war, yet lived under its shadow. The bomb became normalized, integrated into policy and defense budgets. Its presence was constant, but rarely discussed openly. Still, the underlying question never disappeared. Could humanity permanently resist the temptation or miscalculation that would unleash these weapons again? The answer depended not on technology, but on restraint, cooperation, and the lessons drawn from the desert where it all began. Those lessons remained incomplete. Every crisis, every escalation tested them anew. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but it had also begun an era defined by uncertainty. The story was no longer confined to the past. It was unfolding continuously, shaped by decisions yet to be made. And as the world moved forward, carrying the weight of that first explosion, the desert stood as a reminder of a moment when knowledge crossed into irreversible consequence, leaving humanity to live forever with what it had created. The atomic bomb did not remain frozen in history. Long after the dust settled in the desert and the war officially ended, its presence continued to shape every major geopolitical decision. Nations that possessed nuclear weapons carried an unspoken authority, while those without them navigated a world defined by imbalance. Power was no longer measured solely by armies or territory, but by the ability to destroy everything in an instant. Over time, the original secrecy of the Manhattan Project gave way to public knowledge, museums, declassified documents, and survivor testimonies. What had once been hidden behind fences and code names became part of collective memory. Yet understanding did not bring closure. Instead, it deepened the moral complexity. Knowing how the bomb was built only made its existence harder to reconcile. Los Alamos itself transformed into a symbol of contradiction. It remained a center for advanced research, contributing to energy science, medicine, and national security. At the same time, it carried the weight of its origin. Every breakthrough there existed in the shadow of that first weapon assembled under wartime urgency. The desert test site, once chosen for isolation, became a landmark of human transformation. The glass formed by the explosion remained embedded in the sand, a physical reminder that the environment itself had been permanently altered. Unlike conventional weapons, the atomic bomb did not simply destroy and disappear. It changed landscapes, bodies, and the trajectory of history. As the world entered the modern era, new threats emerged: cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and autonomous weapons. Yet none carried the singular finality of nuclear arms. The bomb remained the ultimate boundary, the line no conflict could cross without risking everything. Its continued existence forced leaders to think not just in terms of victory, but survival. The question of responsibility persisted. The scientists who built the bomb in the desert were not villains, nor were they saints. They were individuals operating under extraordinary pressure, shaped by fear of a brutal enemy and driven by belief in ending a devastating war. History does not allow simple judgments. It demands understanding without erasing consequence. What is undeniable is that humanity now lives in a world where self-destruction is technically possible at any moment. That reality began not in a battlefield, but in a remote desert, through calculations, experiments, and choices made by people who could not fully see where the path would lead. The atomic bomb ended World War II, but it also began a permanent test of human restraint. Each generation inherits that test, deciding whether knowledge will be guided by wisdom or ambition. The desert experiment proved what humanity could do. The future will be defined by whether it chooses to do it again. In the end, the story of building the atomic bomb in the desert is not only about science or war, it is about responsibility, consequence, and the fragile balance between creation and destruction. That balance remains unresolved, hanging over the modern world as silently and persistently as the desert sky once watched over the first atomic fire. And as long as those weapons exist, the legacy of that desert will continue, not as history alone, but as a warning written into the foundation of the present.